The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, not the kind born from conflict, but the kind that comes right before a line is crossed. Senator JD Vance, seated at the defense table in a formal federal hearing, was not there to be prosecuted. He was there as a witness, subpoenaed to testify in a politically volatile case surrounding the whistleblower suppression policies of the Department of Justice. But everyone in the room knew it wouldn't stay just testimony. This wasn't a hearing. It was a reckoning. Presiding over the session, Judge Hollis Brennan, a by-the-book federal appointee known for her sharp tongue and intolerance for rhetoric in her courtroom. Brennan was respected, feared, and, as many insiders knew, heavily tied to a particular network of legal operatives who preferred silence over sunlight. As JD Vance adjusted the mic, the judge raised a finger. "Senator," she said firmly, "this is a court of law, not a campaign stop. Choose your words wisely." She leaned forward, icy calm. "You will refrain from inflammatory language. This courtroom is not the place for grandstanding." The audience stiffened. Staffers took notes. C-SPAN broadcasted the moment nationwide. JD Vance paused. He didn't look shaken. He looked tired, but not weary. The kind of tired that comes from years of holding back what needs to be said. And then he spoke. Calm, even, controlled, but with a quote that would ricochet around the country within hours. "Your Honor," he said, "if truth sounds inflammatory in your courtroom, maybe the problem isn't my language." The room froze. The quote hit like a thunderclap. Brennan's lips parted, not in command but in disbelief. She reached for the gavel but didn't bring it down. She couldn't. Because JD Vance continued, voice clear, eyes locked on the bench. "I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here to tell the American people what happens when judges start confusing decorum with discomfort. So no, I won't apologize if truth offends the walls it echoes in." Gasps. Pens stopped scribbling. One journalist tweeted, "Did JD Vance just speak the line of the year?" He had. And Judge Brennan, for the first time in a decade, she didn't speak back. She blinked, and the entire courtroom realized something had just shifted. The moment JD Vance uttered his quote, "If truth sounds inflammatory in your courtroom, maybe the problem isn't my language," it left the courtroom and exploded across the country. Within minutes, every news outlet ran the headline. JD Vance clashes with federal judge, quote goes viral. Truth versus protocol. Vance's statement rocks judiciary hearing. Senator speaks up, judge stunned into silence. The quote was clipped, captioned on TikTok, Twitter, YouTube Shorts, hitting 25 million views in under 6 hours. In the courtroom, Judge Brennan tried to regain control. "Senator Vance, this court will not tolerate disrespect." JD didn't flinch. "I wasn't disrespectful, I was honest." She glared. "Be brief. Stick to facts." He opened a folder. "Perfect. Let's talk about these facts." What followed wasn't emotion. It was documentation. Emails from DOJ officials pressuring whistleblowers to recant. Internal memos that Judge Brennan herself had ruled inadmissible in prior sealed cases, and one damning surveillance authorization, signed off by a federal panel Brennan once chaired. JD Vance didn't raise his voice. He raised evidence. And the judge, she didn't interrupt again. Outside the courthouse, the crowd doubled. Activists held signs reading, "Language isn't the threat, lies are, let him speak. Decorum, cover-up." Cable pundits were split. Some called it a dangerous undermining of judicial decorum. Others said, this is why Vance is feared, because he knows where the line is and what's behind it. Meanwhile, Vance's quote took on a life of its own. "If truth sounds inflammatory, maybe the problem isn't my language." It was printed on T-shirts, spray-painted on courthouse sidewalks, projected on a wall outside the Department of Justice by a protest group. In private, staffers close to Judge Brennan said she was rattled. In her chambers, she re-watched the clip 3 times. She whispered, "How the hell did we lose the room?" JD didn't lose the room. He didn't even try to take it. He just spoke what no one else would say, and let truth do the rest. The next day, the courtroom was packed to the walls, not just because of the drama, but because the judge was about to strike back. Judge Hollis Brennan, bruised from public blowback, now saw her own credibility on the edge. The clip of JD Vance's quote had gone international, and what was supposed to be a tightly controlled hearing had become a battleground for truth. And Brennan? She wasn't going to lose quietly. As the hearing resumed, Brennan opened with a prepared statement. Her voice sharp, rehearsed, but brittle. Let the record show that this court maintains full authority over proceedings. We will not allow political theatrics, public pressure, or personal posturing to influence the rule of law. She turned directly to JD Vance. Senator, unless you are prepared to revise your language and comply with courtroom conduct, I will instruct the clerk to strike your previous remarks from the official record. Murmurs swept the room. The stenographer looked up. Even the DOJ attorneys shifted uncomfortably. But JD didn't blink. He stood. Your Honor, if you strike my words from the record, you're not just erasing a quote, you're erasing the moment the truth made you uncomfortable. He walked slowly toward the evidence display. I didn't break decorum. I broke the pattern. You asked me to watch my language. I watched it very carefully. And I chose every word because they weren't just for this court. They were for every American, watching who's been told that silence is more polite than honesty. The crowd froze again. Cameras flashed from outside the doors. Even one of Brennan's aides dropped their pen. JD turned and faced the gallery. This isn't about my tone. It's about your tolerance. Tolerance for what's been hidden in sealed transcripts, redacted documents, and phrases like national security that are used not to protect lives but to protect lies. He pointed gently to the judge. I won't revise what I said. I won't strike it. Because if courts can't stand up to a sentence, how can we expect them to stand up for the people? A single clap broke the silence. Then another. The gallery began to rise slowly, respectfully. Not a protest, an affirmation. Let him speak. Let the record show. Truth is not a violation. Judge Brennan said nothing. She stared at her notes, then quietly closed the folder on her bench. No strike. No rebuke. Because Vance had made it impossible to erase what now lived in the minds of millions. That evening, the clip of JD Vance's exchange with Judge Brennan, unedited, uncut, was played live on nearly every network. What was originally a judicial hearing had now become a cultural flashpoint, and Washington, D.C. could no longer sit still. On Capitol Hill, the ripple effect hit fast. Within 48 hours, 12 senators, across party lines, co-signed a resolution titled On the Preservation of Truthful Speech in Judicial Proceedings. It wasn't just symbolic. It was a public statement that decorum should never outweigh transparency. Senator Claudia Mendez, a moderate Democrat from Nevada, addressed the Senate floor. When Senator Vance told the truth, the judge threatened to erase it. That moment tells us more about our system than anything said in the courtroom that day. It's time we stop treating truth like it's too dangerous for the record. The resolution trended under the hashtag #LetTheRecordShow. It flooded social media. Journalists, veterans, whistleblowers, activists, teachers. Let the record show I was silenced for asking questions. Let the record show we remember who spoke up. Let the record show we heard JD Vance, and we're not forgetting it. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan faced mounting pressure. Whispers of judicial bias, political collusion, and selective enforcement of courtroom rules began circulating, not from trolls, but from former judicial clerks. One wrote anonymously, "We were told to value the appearance of order over the presence of truth." Vance flipped that script. In Ohio, JD's home state, thousands gathered in a candlelight vigil, not in protest, but in recognition. They read his quote aloud like a civic prayer. If truth sounds inflammatory, maybe the problem isn't my language. Back in D.C., JD remained quiet. No interviews, no press tours. When asked by a reporter how he felt, he simply said, "I didn't go there to go viral. I went there to speak for the ones who were never invited into the courtroom in the first place." And now, the Senate Judiciary Committee wanted to hear from him, on record under oath, not to investigate him. To ask what else he knew. The room wasn't large, it wasn't televised, but what was said inside would soon echo far louder than anything said in public. JD Vance entered the private Judiciary Committee chamber, met by 6 senators, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, not hostile, not supportive, just focused. At the head of the table sat Chairman Royce Wendell, a 40-year Senate veteran known for balancing loyalty to the system with occasional flashes of courage. Wendell folded his hands. "Senator Vance, we didn't call you here to reprimand. We called you because your testimony opened a door we didn't expect. And now we need to know what else is behind it." JD placed a stack of folders on the table. One word on the cover, severance. The room shifted, because that wasn't just a name. It was a code name, a secretive internal program allegedly used by certain federal judges and DOJ officials to reroute whistleblower cases into administrative holds, effectively erasing them from the docket without a ruling. JD looked around the room. 3 years ago, I requested these files during a separate oversight review. I was told they didn't exist. Last month, they showed up in an anonymous packet on my desk. They detail 17 cases, all blocked, all sealed, all rerouted under Judge Brennan's oversight panel. Silence. A senator from Oregon leaned in. Are you accusing her of intentional suppression? JD didn't flinch. I'm not accusing. I'm documenting. You all saw what happened in that courtroom. That wasn't about tone. It was about a pattern. He flipped the folder open. Inside, a memo labeled Severance 3A, an internal audit that had never been released, and a set of case summaries with redacted whistleblower identities. JD tapped the table. This is what you strike from the record when the language is too strong. Chairman Wendell looked visibly shaken. He stood up, walked to the window, and stared at the Capitol dome. Then said, "We always knew there were shadows in this system. We just didn't know whose hand was on the switch." By the end of the day, a second inquiry was launched, not into JD Vance, into Judge Brennan and the severance protocol. JD left the chamber quietly. As he walked into the sunlight, a reporter asked, "Senator, do you still stand by your quote?" JD paused, then smiled. Now more than ever. Judge Hollis Brennan was never known for humility. She was known for rulings that chilled dissent, for courtroom discipline that bordered on control, and for wielding decorum like a weapon. But now she was cornered. The Senate had launched an official inquiry, sealed cases were being unsealed, and whispers of the severance protocol were becoming headlines. Whistleblower pipeline exposed, Vance cites judicial suppression files. Let the record show Spurs Senate reform efforts. So she did what cornered power always does. She tried to retaliate. In a surprise motion filed overnight and quietly leaked to the press, Judge Brennan submitted a formal judicial ethics complaint against JD Vance. The charge: conduct unbecoming a federal witness, disruptive courtroom behavior, intentional undermining of public trust in judiciary institutions. But this time, the public wasn't buying it. The backlash was instant. This is why he said what he said. Now we know who's scared of the truth. This isn't about language, it's about power losing control. Even legal scholars who previously stayed silent began speaking up. Professor Amina Clark, Harvard Law, Judge Brennan's complaint is not a defense of justice, it's an indictment of her inability to face it. JD Vance responded the only way he knows how, on the record. He stood outside the courthouse steps the morning after the complaint hit the wire, with the Capitol behind him and a copy of the Constitution in his pocket. Let me be clear. I don't regret a word I said in that courtroom. If what I said violated decorum, maybe decorum needs to be rewritten. If the truth shook the room, that says more about the room than it does about me. And then he did something Brennan never saw coming. He released the full transcript of the sealed severance documents to the press. Names redacted, facts intact. Within hours, the files were being dissected on every major network. The cases, the reroutes, the denials, it was all real. That afternoon, Judge Brennan's complaint was dismissed, unanimously, by the Federal Judicial Conduct Board. The dismissal notice contained just one sentence. Freedom of speech does not become misconduct when it holds power accountable. Brennan didn't return to court the next day. She didn't even show up to chambers. Because the quote she tried to silence had now become policy, protest, and precedent. 3 weeks after the failed retaliation by Judge Brennan, the nation saw something rare, a bipartisan bill born from a courtroom confrontation. It was introduced under the title, the Judicial Integrity and Free Speech Protection Act, but everyone was already calling it the Vance Doctrine. The bill was simple and seismic. It prohibited federal judges from striking witness testimony unless it directly incited violence or threats. It required transparency in sealed court proceedings involving whistleblower claims, and it guaranteed all witness testimony before federal courts and congressional hearings would be preserved in full, even if it offended institutional decorum. The preamble began with one line. If truth sounds inflammatory, maybe the problem isn't the language. In Congress, Debate on the bill was almost non-existent. Democrats called it a necessary correction to an unchecked bench. Republicans called it a defense of the First Amendment under fire. Independents called it what the system forgot. It passed 92-6 in the Senate and 403-25 in the House. In the courtroom where it began, the gallery stood in silence as the plaque was installed beneath the bench. The Vance Doctrine. Let the record show. Truth is not a disruption. Outside, something remarkable happened. Law students from across the country held a coordinated reading of Vance's original courtroom quote at 50 state capitals simultaneously. It was broadcast on C-SPAN. It trended as Let the Record Show live. Meanwhile, Judge Brennan filed for early retirement, citing health and personal well-being. She left quietly, no statements, no interviews. But in her office, a junior clerk found a printout on her desk. It was the transcript of that infamous courtroom moment. Underlined in her handwriting, "Maybe the problem isn't my language." JD Vance didn't claim victory. He didn't tweet. He didn't tour cable networks. He simply issued a one-line statement. "I didn't say it to go viral. I said it because someone had to." The Vance Doctrine hadn't just passed. It had opened the floodgates. Across the country, those who had once sat silently behind desks, in labs, in back offices of agencies and legal firms, were now beginning to step forward. And one of them would soon make headlines of his own. Elias Curran was a mid-level cybersecurity analyst at a federal contractor affiliated with DHS. For 5 years, he'd said nothing. He had watched whistleblower reports disappear. He had watched internal reviews turn into internal purges, and he'd watched his own name end up on a risk monitoring list for asking too many questions about civilian data collection. But when JD Vance stood up in that courtroom, and when the system tried and failed to silence him, Elias made a decision. He filed a formal protected disclosure. He went public, and he quoted Vance's exact words. "They told me not to raise the alarm, that it would make me a problem. But as JD Vance said, if the truth offends the room, maybe we need to change the room." The story broke wide. Elias exposed a quietly expanded program called DOME, a private database of journalist, activist, and civil servant metadata used to pre-screen threats in federal contract disputes. His documents were real. His proof was undeniable. And his bravery, it was already being called the second echo of the Vance Doctrine. News outlets compared the two cases, Vance's courtroom stand and Curran's quiet, data-driven bombshell. One editorial headline read, "Truth just got a blueprint. JD Vance lit the match. Now others carry the flame." JD Vance responded not with commentary, but with action. He appeared beside Curran during his first congressional testimony. When reporters asked why, he said, "Because someone once stood behind me when I said the truth out loud. Now it's my turn." That photo, the two men walking side by side up the Capitol steps, went viral. Captioned, "Let the record show." We're not done yet. It wasn't a campaign rally. It wasn't a Senate speech. It wasn't a press conference. It was something rarer. A national address by request. Congress had invited Senator JD Vance to deliver a formal televised address from the floor of the U.S. Capitol, not as a partisan figure, but as the man whose words had just reshaped federal legal doctrine and inspired a wave of transparency across the government. Millions tuned in. JD Vance stepped into the well of the chamber, alone. The room was full, silent, focused. He wore no flag pin, no power tie, just a folder, the same one he'd carried into that courtroom months earlier. He began, "I never intended to speak a sentence that would become law. I didn't go viral to make noise. I stood up because the truth had been sitting down for too long, in sealed courtrooms, redacted memos, and rulings dressed up as reason but designed to silence." He raised the folder. "This folder is full of things that were once struck from the record, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. We talk a lot about justice in this country, but too often we treat it like a set of rules for the polite, a script for those who never ask uncomfortable questions." His voice dropped slightly. "But justice isn't polite. Justice is persistent. Justice is the mother in the courtroom gallery who never got her son's case unsealed, the whistleblower who waited 5 years for a real investigation, the contractor who thought he was crazy until he saw a senator say, 'If truth offends this courtroom, maybe the problem isn't my language.' Justice is them. I just gave it a microphone." Across the country, homes were quiet. Phones down. People listened. JD continued, "The Vance Doctrine isn't about me. It's about the idea that speaking clearly, boldly, and truthfully is not a violation. It's a duty. If you ever find yourself standing in a room where the truth feels too sharp for the ears around you, don't lower your voice. Raise it so the record hears it." The applause began slowly, then rose to its feet. Not just in the chamber, in homes, online, in classrooms, in courthouses, and outside. Someone chalked it on the Capitol steps. "Let the record show." He said what needed to be said. The echoes didn't fade. They deepened. Across the country, in small towns and capital cities, classrooms and courtrooms, the ripple that began with one sentence in a tense federal hearing had become a cultural shift. If truth sounds inflammatory, maybe the problem isn't the language. That quote now appeared. In textbooks on American civics, on the wall of a journalism school at Northwestern, in the opening slide of federal ethics training, and engraved in granite outside the Whistleblower Protection Office in D.C. JD Vance didn't become president. He didn't run. He didn't need to, because what he'd done was something even rarer. He proved that courage doesn't need a title to make history. He remained in the Senate, still blunt, still relentless, still quoting the Constitution more than sound bites. But whenever someone stood up, to speak, to challenge, to tell the truth despite pressure, they were asked, "Are you quoting Vance?" And often they were. In a small courtroom in Kansas, a judge heard a public defender speak bluntly about a sealed case that had gone unexamined for too long. The prosecutor raised an objection, calling it inflammatory rhetoric. The judge shook his head. "No, that's called accountability. Let the record show we don't strike the truth anymore." In a college debate in Ohio, a young woman quoted Vance on stage. When the moderator asked why she chose him as inspiration, she smiled, because he reminded us that truth doesn't need permission to exist. And in the Capitol, a plaque now hangs on the chamber wall where he gave his televised address. It reads, "Truth doesn't disrupt the record, it writes it." JD Vance, 2025, the moment passed, the name endured, but more importantly, the standard changed, not just for courts, for everyone.